People said the Harrison family owned half the county, but the truth was far more dangerous than that. We owned a reputation that nobody dared question. My name is Ethan Harrison, and for most of my life I believed I had been born into something permanent. The Harrison estate sat on more than 50 acres of carefully maintained land, surrounded by iron gates, stone walls, and generations of history. People in town spoke about our family with admiration. Local charities depended on our donations. Business leaders attended our events. Politicians shook our hands. From the outside, we looked like the definition of success. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every summer gathering at the lake house seemed to reinforce the same idea. The Harrison family always won. That was what everyone believed. It was what I believed too. The mansion itself felt more like a private institution than a home. The grand dining room could host dozens of guests beneath crystal chandeliers. The library contained shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Portraits of previous generations watched from the walls as if they were still supervising the family they had built. Nothing about the estate suggested weakness. Nothing suggested decline. Yet looking back now, I realized the cracks had already started to appear long before anyone noticed them. They were simply hidden beneath wealth, tradition, and silence. The first person who made me question everything was Harrison. Most guests assumed he was a distant relative who had somehow remained attached to the family over the years. He rarely attended public events. He wore old denim shirts instead of expensive suits. He never seemed interested in impressing anyone. At family dinners, he sat at the far end of the long oak table, speaking only when necessary. Yet despite his quiet presence, something about him unsettled people. I noticed it whenever important decisions were discussed. Executives listened carefully when he entered a room. Thomas, our longtime family attorney, always acknowledged him first. Even Victoria, who seemed to control every conversation she joined, occasionally watched him when she thought nobody was looking. One rainy evening, the entire family gathered for dinner. Isabel poured wine beside David while Eleanor sat beneath the chandelier, staring into her plate. The fireplace glowed softly across the room. Outside, rain rolled down the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds. Everything looked elegant. Everything looked stable. Yet as I watched the people around that table, I realized nobody was speaking freely. Every sentence seemed measured. Every opinion seemed calculated. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering whether the family everyone admired was actually holding itself together through fear rather than loyalty. The morning after that dinner, I could not shake the feeling that I had witnessed something important without fully understanding it. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the estate wrapped in a cool gray mist. From my bedroom window, the Harrison mansion looked exactly as it always had. Imposing, elegant, untouchable, yet the image no longer felt convincing. For the first time, I found myself wondering how much of our family's strength was real and how much existed only because everyone agreed to pretend it was real. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room overlooking the Eastern Gardens. David reviewed financial reports while Isabel discussed preparations for an upcoming charity gala. Eleanor quietly stirred her tea. Victoria entered several minutes later, and just as she had the night before, the atmosphere shifted. Nobody announced her arrival. Nobody stood. Yet conversations subtly adjusted around her presence. Topics changed. Opinions softened. Decisions that seemed open for discussion suddenly became settled. The change was so natural that most people probably never noticed it. I did. Later that afternoon, I accompanied David to one of the family's corporate offices downtown. The building carried the Harrison name across its entrance in polished bronze letters. Employees greeted us respectfully. Executives stepped aside as we walked through the hallways. Everything projected authority. During a meeting involving several senior managers, I expected David to lead the discussion. Officially, he was the future of the family business. Yet something unexpected happened. Every time a major decision approached, people looked toward Victoria. She was not even leading the meeting. She simply sat near the window reviewing notes. Still, the room seemed to wait for her approval before moving forward. On the drive back to the estate, I asked David why that happened. He kept his eyes on the road for several moments before answering. "Influence is not always visible," he said. It sounded less like an explanation and more like a warning. That evening, another gathering filled the mansion with guests. Business partners, local officials, family friends. The grand rooms glowed with warm light, while conversations drifted through the halls. Harrison remained near the library doorway, dressed in the same worn denim shirt that made him look completely disconnected from the wealth surrounding him. Most guests ignored him, yet I noticed something strange. Several people glanced toward him throughout the evening, not with recognition, not with affection, with caution, as if his presence alone made them uncomfortable. Then I caught something even more surprising. Across the room, Victoria looked toward Harrison for a brief moment. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes revealed something I had never seen before: concern. And suddenly, I began to suspect that the most powerful people in the Harrison family were not afraid of losing money or influence. They were afraid of something Harrison knew. Over the next several days, I started paying attention to something I had never noticed before. Every family has subjects that make people uncomfortable. Ours had entire sections of history that seemed to disappear whenever they were mentioned. The pattern revealed itself slowly. During lunch one afternoon, Eleanor began telling a story about a family gathering from decades earlier. She spoke warmly at first, describing a summer at the lake house and relatives I had never met. Then she mentioned a name. The reaction was immediate. David lowered his eyes toward his plate. Isabel changed the subject. Victoria reached for her water glass and calmly redirected the conversation. Within seconds, the story was gone. Nobody argued. Nobody explained. It was as if everyone had rehearsed the response years ago. Later that week, I found myself walking through the mansion's west corridor where old photographs covered the walls. Generations of Harrison family members stared out from elaborate frames. Weddings, business milestones, charity events, vacations, decades of carefully preserved memories. Yet something felt strange. Certain years appeared unusually empty. Certain faces appeared only once and never again. The collection looked complete until you studied it closely. Then the gaps became impossible to ignore. That evening, I visited the library hoping to distract myself with work. Instead, I found Harrison sitting near the fireplace with a book resting on his lap. The room smelled faintly of old paper and wood smoke. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "Have you noticed how much effort people spend protecting old stories?" he asked. I looked at him carefully. "What stories?" Harrison smiled slightly. "The ones that stopped being useful." Before I could ask another question, he returned to his book as though the conversation had never happened. The answer bothered me for the rest of the night. A few days later, the family gathered again in the grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the long oak table while rain tapped softly against the windows. Business matters dominated most of the discussion. Then one of the older family associates casually referenced a former Harrison successor during a conversation about leadership. The room froze. It lasted only a moment, but I saw it clearly. Victoria's expression tightened. Thomas immediately shifted the discussion elsewhere. Even David looked uncomfortable. The guest apologized and moved on. Nobody mentioned the comment again. Yet as I looked around the table, I realized something important. The secret was not that certain people knew the truth. The secret was that everyone knew enough to avoid it. And for the first time, I began to understand that whatever had happened in the past was still shaping every decision being made inside the Harrison family. The discovery came by accident, which later seemed impossible considering how carefully the family protected its secrets. A week after that uncomfortable dinner, I was helping organize records at one of the Harrison offices downtown. Most of the files involved routine business matters: property taxes, lease agreements, insurance renewals, the kind of paperwork nobody paid attention to. I worked alone in a quiet records room lined with metal cabinets and storage boxes dating back decades. Near the bottom of one cabinet, I found a folder that appeared out of place. It had been filed behind several unrelated documents, almost as if someone wanted it overlooked rather than hidden. The label contained only a reference number, nothing unusual. Yet when I opened it, something immediately felt wrong. The paperwork inside involved a family trust connected to several properties owned by the Harrison estate. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Then I noticed a section that had been amended years after the original filing. Several names had been removed. Others had been added. One signature page referenced a review that seemed to have occurred without any corresponding explanation. I was not a lawyer, but even I could tell the sequence did not make sense. Before I could study it further, the door opened. Thomas stepped into the room carrying a briefcase. The moment he saw the folder in my hands, he stopped walking. It lasted only a second, but the reaction was unmistakable. Thomas never looked surprised. This time he did. "Where did you find that?" he asked calmly. I pointed toward the cabinet. His eyes moved briefly to the drawer before returning to me. "That file belongs in legal archives," he said. "It should not be here." The answer felt rehearsed. I asked whether there was a problem with the document. Thomas smiled politely. "Only if someone misunderstands what they are reading." Then he took the folder and placed it inside his briefcase. The conversation ended there. Later that evening, I could not stop thinking about what had happened. I called Sophia and described everything I remembered. She listened carefully before asking one question. "Did Thomas explain why the amendments were made?" "No." There was a pause. "Then the amendments are probably more important than the original document." Her answer stayed with me. That night, as rain tapped against the library windows, I walked past a partially open doorway and heard voices inside. Victoria and Thomas were speaking quietly. I could not hear every word, but one sentence reached me clearly. Victoria said, "If anyone starts comparing the old records, the entire story falls apart." In that moment, I realized the document was not just paperwork. It was evidence that part of the family's history had been rewritten. After hearing Victoria's warning in the library, I stopped believing that the secret involved a simple legal mistake. Whatever had happened in the past was important enough that powerful people were still protecting it decades later. The question was why. Over the following week, Sophia and I began quietly comparing every piece of information we had collected. Property records, trust amendments, family photographs, meeting notes. None of them provided a complete answer on their own, but together they revealed a pattern. Every major change inside the Harrison family seemed to occur during the same period. Leadership shifted. Ownership structures changed. Certain names disappeared from official records. Most importantly, one individual seemed to vanish from the family's future entirely. His name appeared only briefly in the earliest documents before being replaced by others. One evening, Sophia arrived at the estate carrying a small folder she had obtained from a public archive. We met in the library after most of the family had gone to bed. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows while the fireplace filled the room with a warm glow. Without saying a word, she placed a single document on the table between us. I immediately recognized the name, Andrew Harrison. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. The document described a succession structure created many years earlier. Andrew was not mentioned as a minor beneficiary. He was identified as the primary future heir connected to several significant family holdings. The language was clear. At one point, the future of the Harrison Empire appeared to revolve around him. Yet nobody in the family ever spoke his name. I asked Sophia the question that had been bothering me for days. What happened to him? She shook her head. I do not know, but that is not the most important question anymore. She pointed toward the later amendments attached to the file. Ask who benefited after he disappeared. Her words changed everything. Until that moment, I had focused on the missing piece. Now I started looking at the people who remained. The next night during dinner, I watched the family with new eyes. Victoria guided conversations exactly where she wanted them to go. Thomas quietly observed everyone at the table. David appeared trapped between obligation and uncertainty. Eleanor barely spoke. Then I noticed Harrison. He was watching the room the way someone watches a play they have already seen before. When his eyes met mine, he seemed to understand exactly what I had discovered. He gave the slightest nod before returning his attention to the table. In that moment, I realized I was no longer searching for a forgotten heir. I was beginning to uncover the reason an entire family had agreed to forget him. Once I started asking who benefited, the entire structure of the Harrison family began to look different. The mansion was the same. The businesses were the same. The people were the same. Yet every relationship seemed to carry a hidden layer I had never noticed before. Sophia and I spent the next several days building a timeline from the documents we had collected. We spread copies across a large table inside her office and traced major family decisions year by year. At first, the information looked ordinary. Then patterns emerged. The period immediately following Andrew Harrison's disappearance from succession records coincided with a remarkable shift in power. Trust structures changed. Advisory positions changed. Voting authority changed. The people making decisions remained largely the same, but the people benefiting from those decisions did not. One name appeared repeatedly around nearly every important transition. Victoria, not as the official recipient, not as the direct owner, but always close to the center of the change. The realization unsettled me. For years I had watched Victoria guide conversations and influence decisions. Now I was beginning to wonder whether her authority had deeper roots than anyone realized. That weekend, the family gathered at the lake house for what was supposed to be a routine retreat. The property sat beside a dark stretch of water surrounded by tall pines. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt increasingly strained. During dinner, small disagreements surfaced that normally would have disappeared immediately. David questioned a financial recommendation. Eleanor challenged a detail about an upcoming family event. Even Isabel seemed less eager than usual to support every suggestion made by Victoria. The changes were subtle, but they were there. It was as though the foundation beneath the family was beginning to shift. Later that night, I stepped onto the covered porch overlooking the lake. Harrison stood alone near the railing watching the water. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that caught me completely off guard. The problem with an empire is that people start believing it built itself. I asked him whether he was talking about Victoria. Harrison shook his head. No, I am talking about everyone. He looked toward the dark shoreline. When people benefit from a story long enough, they stop asking whether it is true. Before I could respond, he walked back inside. I remained on the porch staring across the lake. His words echoed in my mind. The more evidence I found, the less this looked like a secret protected by one person. It looked like an entire system maintained by many people. And systems are far more dangerous than individuals because once they begin to fail, nobody can control where the cracks will appear next. The changes that began at the lake house did not disappear when we returned to the estate. If anything, they became harder to ignore. For years, the Harrison family had operated like a machine. Everyone understood their role. Everyone followed the same unwritten rules. Now those rules seemed to be breaking apart. The first sign appeared during a board meeting held in one of the family's corporate offices. Normally, David approved recommendations with little resistance. This time, he asked questions. Not hostile questions, reasonable ones. Yet the reaction around the room was immediate. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances. Victoria remained calm, but I noticed her watching David more closely than usual. By the end of the meeting, nothing dramatic had happened, yet something important had changed. For the first time, David was no longer moving in perfect alignment with the system that had guided him for years. Back at the estate, the tension continued to grow. Eleanor spent more time alone in the library. James became noticeably quieter. Even Isabel seemed uncertain about conversations she would normally navigate with confidence. It felt as though everyone sensed the same thing. The foundation beneath the family was shifting, and nobody knew where it would stop. A few days later, Sophia called with new information. We met in a private conference room overlooking the city. Spread across the table were copies of trust records, board resolutions, and succession plans collected from multiple decades. Together, they revealed something impossible to ignore. The people who benefited after Andrew disappeared were not limited to one individual. Influence had spread throughout the family structure. Certain opportunities appeared. Certain obstacles vanished. Entire career paths changed. The deeper we looked, the more obvious it became that many people had gained something from the rewritten version of history. That evening, another family dinner filled the grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished wood while rain tapped softly against the windows. Conversation remained polite, but the strain underneath was unmistakable. Then a simple disagreement about a future investment unexpectedly escalated into a larger discussion. David challenged a recommendation. Victoria defended it. Eleanor quietly disagreed with both of them. For several seconds, nobody knew how to respond. The silence felt heavier than any argument. Across the table, Harrison watched everything unfold with the calm expression of a man who had expected this moment for years. When the discussion finally ended, nobody appeared satisfied. As guests slowly left the room, Harrison remained seated beside the fireplace. Our eyes met briefly. He did not smile. He did not speak. Yet I understood the message clearly. The family was no longer protecting the secret together. And once that happened, the collapse of the old order was no longer a possibility. It had already begun. By the time autumn settled across the estate, the Harrison family no longer resembled the institution I had grown up believing in. The mansion still stood proudly above its rolling grounds. The businesses continued operating. Publicly, nothing appeared different. Yet behind closed doors, the certainty that once held everything together had begun to disappear. People were no longer protecting the same version of the past. They were protecting themselves. A few days after that tense dinner, Eleanor asked me to meet her in the library before sunrise. The room was quiet except for the faint crackle of a dying fire. Gray morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the bookshelves. She looked exhausted, older than I had ever seen her. For several moments, she simply stared at a photograph resting on the table between us. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Some secrets survive because people are afraid of them. Others survive because people convince themselves they are necessary. She slid the photograph toward me. It showed a younger Harrison standing beside several family members at the lake house decades earlier. Among them was Andrew Harrison. Seeing his face again felt strange. He had become almost mythical through the fragments we had uncovered. Yet there he was, smiling naturally, standing where everyone could see him. He was never supposed to disappear, Eleanor said quietly. Before I could ask another question, she handed me a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of correspondence, meeting notes, and succession discussions dating back more than 30 years. As I read through them, one fact became impossible to ignore. Harrison had spent decades preserving records that others wanted forgotten. He had never publicly challenged the family. He had never exposed anyone. Instead, he had simply kept the truth alive. That evening, I met Harrison in the library. Rain rolled against the windows while the estate settled into silence around us. I placed the documents on the table between us. He studied them briefly before nodding. "You finally understand," he said. "Understand what?" I asked. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "The story everyone tells about this family is not the same as the story that actually happened." The room fell silent. Then he opened a small wooden box and removed several original records. Unlike the copy Sophia and I had found, these documents contained signatures, dates, and annotations that had never been altered. The original succession plan, the original structure of the family's future. Looking at them felt like looking through a doorway into a different history. And as I turned the final page, I realized the truth Harrison had protected for all these years was powerful enough to change how every member of the family understood their place in the empire. The final gathering took place on a cold evening beneath the chandeliers of the grand dining room. Every major figure in the Harrison family sat around the long oak table that had witnessed decades of celebrations, agreements, and carefully protected silences. Outside, winter winds moved across the estate grounds while the last traces of daylight disappeared beyond the tall windows. Nobody spoke much before the meeting began. The usual confidence was gone. The familiar certainty that had once defined the family had vanished. In its place sat anticipation. Thomas arrived carrying several folders and placed them carefully at the center of the table. Harrison remained seated at the far end as he always had. Yet this time nobody ignored him. Everyone understood that the answers they had spent years avoiding were finally about to surface. One by one, the original records were reviewed. Dates, signatures, succession plans, trust structures, correspondence preserved for decades. The documents confirmed what many had privately suspected but never dared acknowledge. Andrew Harrison had not simply faded from the family's history. His place within the future of the family had been altered, and over time an entirely different narrative had replaced the original one. No dramatic confrontation followed. No raised voices filled the room. The truth itself carried enough weight. David studied the documents in silence. Eleanor wiped away quiet tears as years of unanswered questions finally found resolution. Even Victoria appeared less like a commanding figure and more like someone confronting the consequences of decisions that had shaped generations. Across the room, I realized something unexpected. The empire had not collapsed because one person had acted alone. It had weakened because too many people accepted a version of events they knew was incomplete. Harrison finally stood and looked around the room. "Families survive mistakes," he said calmly. "What destroys them is pretending mistakes never happened." Nobody challenged him. Nobody needed to. The evidence resting on the table spoke for itself. Hours later, As the meeting came to an end, people slowly left the dining room. Some carried documents. Others carried questions. The future remained uncertain. Yet for the first time in my life, uncertainty felt healthier than illusion. I remained near the window watching the lights across the estate. Harrison sat quietly beside the fireplace, saying nothing more. The old system that had governed the family for decades was gone. Not destroyed by outsiders. Not taken by rivals. It had unraveled under the weight of its own hidden history. And as the mansion settled into silence, I understood the lesson that would remain long after the records were archived. The Harrison family had spent years protecting its image. Only when it chose to face the truth did it finally have a chance to rebuild.